When Japan carried out its surprise strike on Pearl Harbor, it didn't take a genius to figure out the United States was going to hit back. And when Germany and Italy, in what can only be described as an incredibly dumb decision, went ahead and declared war on the US as well, it meant America now had even more enemies to deal with. But even though Berlin and Rome hadn't actually attacked American soil, the US decided to put its main effort toward them first, following what became known as the Europe First strategy. Still, considering how devastating Pearl Harbor was and how furious the American public became afterward, it raises a fair question. Why didn't the United States pour everything it had into crushing Japan and avenging that attack? Why did it choose to take down Germany and Italy before finishing things in the Pacific? As everyone knows, the attack on Pearl Harbor stunned the country. Almost overnight, isolationist and anti-war opinions vanished and were replaced by a mindset that Japan had gone way too far. It shouldn't surprise anyone that the public, politicians, and especially the military were hungry for payback. President Roosevelt quickly went to Congress to ask for a declaration of war, which passed without opposition if you're willing to overlook the single congresswoman who voted no. With that vote done, the United States was finally free to unleash its massive industrial and military power on the nation that had attacked it. But before any of that could really get rolling, Germany and Italy stepped in and declared war on America themselves. Now, while the US could have mostly brushed off Italy, Germany was a much bigger problem. German submarines could now openly attack American ships crossing the Atlantic, and they wasted no time doing exactly that. This suddenly forced the U.S. Navy into a serious fight in the Atlantic, on top of everything already happening in the Pacific. That reality meant American resources couldn't all go in one direction and would have to be split. It also wasn't exactly a secret that President Franklin D. Roosevelt sympathized with the Allied cause and had been looking for ways to support Britain long before the U.S. officially entered the war. A big reason for that was his belief that Germany posed the greatest long-term danger to the United States. He worried that if the Germans took control of Europe, it wouldn't be long before Berlin started meddling in the Western Hemisphere. With help from Japan, that could eventually turn into a real threat to the American mainland. Now that the US was fully committed to the war, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wasted no time heading to Washington to hammer out a joint strategy. One of their first decisions was to create a unified command system and share key technologies, something the Axis powers didn't bother with, which I'm sure turned out great for them. The biggest argument, though, was over which front the Americans would prioritize. The British were laser-focused on Germany, since it was an immediate threat to their survival, and Churchill found plenty of support within the U.S. Army. From the Army's point of view, fighting Germany meant a massive land war, which played directly to their strengths. The war against Japan, by contrast, offered fewer chances for large-scale ground combat, and many Army leaders worried they'd end up playing second fiddle to the Navy. And yes, rivalry between branches was very much alive in the U.S. military. That rivalry, however, was nothing compared to the outright hostility between the Japanese Army and Navy. Most of the U.S. Navy, for obvious reasons, wanted to send the Japanese fleet straight to the bottom of the ocean and preferred to just hold Germany at bay in the Atlantic while they handled that job. This major Anglo-American strategy meeting happened only weeks after Pearl Harbor, so emotions were still raw and tempers were high. Even so, Churchill managed to walk away with most of what he wanted by persuading the Americans on a few key points. He argued that unlike Japan, Germany represented a direct, existential threat to both London and Moscow. There was no telling how long the Soviet Union could withstand the ongoing German invasion. If the U.S. didn't help secure the Atlantic and start funneling supplies to the Soviets, Churchill warned, the USSR might collapse sooner than expected. If that happened, Germany would be free to shift all its strength against Britain, and Churchill couldn't promise that his country would survive such a concentrated assault. And if Britain either fell or was forced into a peace deal, there would be no practical way to kick Germany out of Europe. That would leave the U.S. facing a far more dangerous enemy in the long run. On the other hand, if America focused on Germany right away, it could ensure that both Britain and the Soviet Union stayed in the fight. Once Germany was defeated, Churchill argued, the British Empire and the USSR could then turn their attention toward Japan alongside the US. Facing all three at once, Japan wouldn't stand a chance. Still, not everyone in the American military bought this argument, and some felt the British weren't pulling their weight. General George Marshall, in particular, believed the British Army hadn't performed especially well up to that point. He argued that Britain wasn't making serious preparations for a major invasion of Europe and was instead expecting American troops to do most of the fighting and dying. Marshall was willing to back a Europe-first strategy, but only if the Allies committed to invading Europe in early 1942. That idea was quickly shut down, since neither Britain nor the United States could gather enough troops or equipment in time to pull off an invasion, much less make it succeed. Because of all that, Churchill and Roosevelt eventually settled on a middle ground. Rather than having American troops sit around in Britain for years waiting on an invasion that couldn't happen yet, they agreed the US would strike North Africa instead. That move would pull German resources away from other fronts and also ease some of the pressure bearing down on the Soviet Union. After North Africa was brought under control, the Allies could then move against what they saw as Europe's weak spot, either by pushing through Italy or heading into the Balkans. Landing in Africa also came with a useful side benefit, since it discouraged Spain from entering the war, which was a win all by itself. For the crowd that wanted Japan crushed first, though, this compromise wasn't very satisfying. Their argument was that Germany was mostly a short-term danger to American shipping. Japan, on the other hand, if left unchecked, could steamroll across the Pacific, grab huge amounts of resources, dig in deep, and make it far harder for the US to strike back later by eliminating potential staging areas. Still, one major thing working against the Japan First camp was the set of war plans the US had already been developing since the 1930s. These were the well-known Rainbow Plans, designed to prepare America for a variety of possible wars against different combinations of enemies. One of those, Rainbow WWII, assumed the United States would be fighting Germany, Japan, and Italy while allied with Britain and France. Under that plan, Britain would dominate naval operations, while France, like in the previous World War, would keep the Germans tied down on the continent. Rainbow WWII called for the U.S. Navy to secure the Atlantic first, then massively expand the army to the kind of force that had beaten Germany in World War I, and only after Europe was dealt with would Japan be taken down. Aside from the part where France collapses, it turned out to be a surprisingly accurate preview of how the war would actually play out. With that in mind, both countries agreed on a plan to slow Japan's expansion while Germany was handled first. One key step was having Britain, the United States, Australia, and the Dutch government in exile combine their command structures in Southeast Asia. The idea was to establish what was called the Malay Barrier, a defensive line that was supposed to block Japanese advances. If it worked, it would protect India and Australia and deny Japan access to the region's resources and manpower. Quick spoiler here, it didn't work. On top of that, Britain promised to step up its military presence in East Asia. Both nations also agreed to increase aid to China, keeping them in the war so they could continue tying down Japanese forces. In the end, Roosevelt had the final word, and while he wanted Britain to survive the war, he wasn't naive about the bigger picture. He had already squeezed several concessions out of Churchill during 1940 and 1941. Roosevelt believed that even if Britain managed to win, its time as a global superpower was basically finished. That meant Britain, along with Germany and Japan, would no longer be in a position to seriously threaten the United States. That belief was another reason he signed off on a Europe-first strategy. Or more specifically, a Germany-first strategy. Now, you might assume that once this decision was made, the Americans followed it to the letter. Funny thing is, they didn't. The actual agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill was that the US would slow down Japanese expansion. But to Navy leadership, stalling was open to interpretation. The United States went on a massive shipbuilding spree to take the fight directly to Japan and also poured troops into the Pacific theater. Over the next year, the U.S. Navy handed the Japanese Navy several devastating defeats. In fact, the first major American offensive of the war didn't happen in Europe at all. It happened at Guadalcanal. Despite the official Europe First policy, the Pacific absorbed most of Washington's attention and resources until late 1943. It wasn't until preparations for D-Day ramped up that the U.S. truly shifted its focus toward Germany over Japan. A big reason for that was that in Europe, the Soviets were doing most of the heavy lifting. Without them, the U.S. would almost certainly have had to commit far more men and material to that front. As history played out, Germany surrendered first. Before the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire could fully redirect their combined strength toward Japan, Japan also surrendered unconditionally, for reasons. In the end, America's industrial power, population size, and military expertise were so overwhelming that it had more than enough of everything needed to defeat the Axis while also keeping its allies supplied. The Europe First strategy was never really about whether America would survive the war. It was about using resources wisely and avoiding unnecessary American casualties. That meant holding Japan in check before it could fully dig in, while propping up Britain and the Soviet Union so Germany couldn't do the same. When all was said and done, what happened on the ground meant that Europe First mostly existed on paper. It reassured the British by reducing the immediate threat to their islands. And just as importantly, it never stopped the US Navy, Marines, and Army from going after Japan, which is what the American public wanted more than anything else. If you like exploring history beyond the textbook, subscribe to the channel. There's plenty more ahead.